Welcome to this month's AI in construction. So there's been a lot of talk about AI agents. It's been around for a while, but it's really starting to get some traction. So I thought we'd dig into what AI agents are and some issues to think of as you're thinking of them. We're going to end with thinking about agents as automations and it's kind of setting up the next two webinars, which I'll talk about at the end. So, as I mentioned, like I just took a look at this that it's, I actually thought 2024 was going to be the year of agents, and I was off by a year. So it turns out that this year, I mean, it's amazing how right at the turn of the year, people started talking about it as soon as they got over the holidays. And there's all sorts of talk. There always kind of is about how much money this is going to be, whether it's 50 billion or whatever number. Frankly, I think it'll probably be more, but it's going to be tough to account for. So no matter what, there's a lot of attention being paid to this. There's a lot of companies raising a lot of money on the software side. And I thought it would be a good idea to dig into what agents are and how they work. So let's start with that. Let's start with this term. What often happens in AI, and some of you will know, I get a little allergic to the idea of throwing around words without defining what they even mean. So an agent is just a person, or in this case, a software that acts on behalf of another person or group. And that's really important because as we think about what distinguishes an agent versus something else, is this cool idea that it'll go off and do things while you're doing other things yourself. Unlike other software where you pretty much need to be there in front of it for it to get done what you want to get done. The promise of AI agents is that they'll do things, overnight or when you're not looking, or you can have 15 of them running at once. We're just going to get started today talking about the implications of that. First, though, I want to dig into what these things even are. So where do they fit in this? So if you've been paying attention, and if you're here, you probably are paying attention. There's been a lot of talk of different types of AI. So I jokingly call this the AI zoo. So we've heard about chatbots. That's kind of what kicked it all up 2 years ago. And what do these do? Well, these answer and create based primarily on their own memory. So this is, what you call pre-training. It's they spent however much money, looking at the whole internet. The thing that you've been seeing more of over the last 6 months for sure are co-pilots. And these are where that answer and create based on your data or data that you show it or data you provide to it. So this is where you're seeing Microsoft do a bunch of things. Procore's done some things, and a number of other companies. When you've ever heard the term retrieval augmented generation, or RAG, that's generally what they're talking about. Now, folks, look, the thing about these terms is absolutely people have different versions of them, but this to me makes sense. Where you're thinking about chatbots as kind of the baseline, you add access to data and content, you've got yourself a co-pilot. But then when you plug it into tools and some other things that we'll talk about later, you get an agent. And here it's really focused on a goal. So you could argue that the chatbot had a goal and the co-pilot had a goal. Absolutely. The difference here is it's got a series of steps, and often it has tools that it's using, whether that, and we'll get into what some of the tools that frequently are used are, but often that's other software you're using, like your email, Google Sheets, so on and so forth. So it's just a good way of thinking about how these things fit against each other and thinking about what you want them for. In the case of a chatbot, it just works out of the box. You need to learn how to prompt it, but it works out of the box. In terms of a co-pilot, it's a little more complicated. Are you pointing it at the right data? Is that data formatted the right way? Have you tuned it so that it can deal with that data well? But even so, that's relatively well understood. AI agents, there's a lot of new tooling we're going to cover today that helps us to manage the complexity that an agent could, because it really opens up a huge group of things that could happen now. You're talking about what you normally have software do, you're now having it do autonomously, and things that you don't currently have software do. So hopefully that helps ground us a little in what we mean. So the question that you're going to ask is, or you might ask, isn't that just software? Isn't software out there doing a goal? In this case, no, it's a little bit different. And let's talk about what we mean. So I'm going to go through kind of the difference between standard software and AI agents, kind of piece by piece. And a lot of that has to do with the AI part of it, in that it can handle commands and commands and rules and so on that are a lot more flexible than standard software. So if you think about it, you have to command it, or you have to give it an input in a very specific way. You click a button, or you do with this, or you do with that, or it doesn't know what to do. And it does exactly what it's supposed to. Now, that's actually a benefit as well as a limit, because if that means it's predictable, a point we'll get to in a moment. AI agents are able to act a little more independently. I think that the degree to which they're independent is early days now and will continue to get better over time. Sometimes surprising what it's good at and what it's not good at. But the point is, it's a lot more flexible. And that speaks to the inputs. So once again, you're talking about very narrow, specific inputs that are very explicit in that they're just clearly do this, do this, do this, or click this button, click these series of buttons. The cool thing about AI agents, and actually this is where you see things like ChatGPT really do some interesting things, is you can just talk to it. And some of what we're going to see later is you can build agents using natural language, which is really, I mean, wild if you think about it. Very flexible workflows, or not very flexible, but much more flexible, much more able to deal with context than was true before. Related to explicit is structured. So, again, you're clicking a button in the right order and filling in forms, so on. Again, it handles natural language inputs, not just as the language, but also how unstructured the language can be. You might say things out of order, you might use different words, so on and so forth. And it's pretty robust to that, obviously within limits, but even the fact that you don't have to use exactly the right words or the right clicks or the right series of things, that already is enormously more useful because you don't have to remember as much. You can just talk to it. And if it doesn't get it right, you talk to it again and it gets it right. Really interesting. Similarly, one of the points that I don't get into so much here, but it relates, is you can ask it to ask you questions so you don't have to know everything. A point that I got into in an earlier webinar. And I think interestingly also, unless a software developer goes in and writes new code, they don't improve. Whereas AI agents are able to take their experience with the last time you use them and feed that back into the current session, either as feedback, as an error, or just experience that this is how, Hugh likes to have this thing done or whatever it might be. And the final one that is really interesting because it's just again a totally new behavior is software will fail if the inputs deviate from expected formats. So if you don't give it what it wants, it doesn't know what to do. It just stops. It either fails, it goes into a loop, or it gives you a failure message. AI can be much more fault tolerant. Now, it doesn't always work that way. You have to work for it. But nevertheless, it's much easier to make fault tolerant than standard software because you don't have to list out every edge case or every instance where things might vary, which is, oh my God, I can't even tell you how much nicer that is. And that's one of the experiences that we often get when we're using AI almost anywhere. Is it's surprising how you can just talk to it and you can get pretty far, and then over time, as you iterate, you can get even better. So those are some ways and it really boils down to the AI thing. It really boils down to the ability to take natural inputs, incomplete inputs, and either infer what you mean or just interpret what you mean. Um, One of the things that comes up when we talk about agents is robotic process automation, which a lot of you probably have heard of. And it's worth noting that there's a big relationship between agents and RPA. In that case, you're automating repetitive rule-based tasks. In this case, usually you've mapped something out that people do over and over again and said, "Hey, can we just make the software do this?" In this case, though, this again is very, very similar to what we talked about before. RPA suffers from a lot of the same limits as standard software because it kind of is standard software. When you introduce AI into this, you don't automatically make an agent, but it's a pretty short hop, or it's certainly a good starting point. And a lot of times, the starting point of defining what the workflows are and really understanding what people are doing is where you would want to start with an agent anyway. So again, RPA is not a bad place to start, and people who've got expertise or experience with RPA are often in a good place to do some of the early hard work of making an agent, a point we're going to get to shortly. So hopefully that all makes some sense. So often when we talk about agents, people are all talking in the abstract. So I wanted to talk about what agents, like just show you. So there's a company called make.com. They actually do some really interesting tooling. So you can go in there in a no code, like you don't have to write any code. You sign into some things, you can hook them up, and you can create your own automations. Here is an example of one where it's taking a new entry in QuickBooks, it's pulling an invoice, and it's putting into a Google Sheet for you. Whether this is important to you or not doesn't matter. What matters here is showing how as simple as connecting these things, and I've got myself an automation. Effectively, I've got an agent. What's interesting about this one is it doesn't actually include AI, and you could call it RPA. I'm not going to get nuts about what terms we're using, but it illustrates the fact that we're not here to celebrate the new dawn of AI. We're here to say, how do we make this stuff useful? And sometimes a step might not require AI, sometimes it will. Here's an example of where we do use AI. So in this case, it's a little bit more complicated. You get something in from MailChimp that goes to a little decision area that says it should go to HubSpot or to search for contacts, or it should go to HubSpot and then go into the CRM to update a record, or in this case, to do something else. And what's interesting is this is where we've added AI. I grabbed this shamelessly from make.com's website, so forgive me if I'm not quite as familiar with it. But the point is, these routers are where the decision is being made. AI is often the way you're going to do that. You can also sometimes, depending on your inputs, do it with something else. Sometimes you can hard code it and so on. The key thing here, though, is you've now created a more complicated automation that allows this to go do things. So something new comes in, whether it's an email comes in or whatever, and it automatically is updating your CRM in multiple different ways depending on what came in, which is pretty cool. So hopefully this begins to give you a bit more of a realistic sense of what agents often are. You're connecting together really narrow little activities in a way that is understandable, that hopefully matches either the way you think. Some of this stuff people do in your head, and you might have to pull it apart and say, yes, my brain can do that, these three steps all at once, but I may need to separate them so the software can do it. But it usually isn't terribly hard to figure that out, depending on what you're doing. Sometimes it is harder, but I think wherever you're likely to start isn't going to be that complicated. And there's definitely a lot of work out there about how to do process mapping, which is ultimately what starts this. Um, and how do we even think about mapping these processes? So this is why, for any of you who've been at a software company, you're going to see whiteboards everywhere. And that's because a lot of software development is breaking down and decomposing processes and trying to figure out, how do I turn that into software? What we're talking about with stuff like this is you're not writing the code so much as finding the functions and features that you can get from software you're already using. And the cool thing is lots of modern software already is connected into a Make or a Zapier or whatever. So they've already done a lot of the work. They can basically give you a toolkit that you can say, how do I line these up so that they match to a process that I've spent time mapping? So how do you figure out what to automate? So we're going to talk about what and how. So the first thing to do is to think about dull, repeated actions, things you do over and over again. I'll ask people things like, what's the dumbest thing you do over and over again? Very often, that's not a bad place to start, both because by virtue of being dumb or you thinking it's dumb, it's probably not very complicated. It probably doesn't use a lot of mental effort, but also the fact that it's repeated, someone might have made software that either you're using or that's part of it. So the next part there is, as I mentioned, wherever you can, you want to use standard software, both because you're using it a lot, but also it's probably plugged into one of these platforms. So productivity apps are a great start for this. So email, calendar, Excel, so on, all these things are already plugged into this stuff. Scheduling, project management software like Monday.com and so on, and then the CRMs and so on. And let me stop for a minute and say I'm using this type of agent to illustrate the broader point of agent. There are definitely, and we'll see that in a minute, companies that are giving you like agents out of the box, but they're in a box. So by doing it this way, I can show you kind of a version of what's in the box that software company has gone and created. Hopefully that makes some sense. So I'm not suggesting you're going to spend your life automating all of what you do, so much as to say, these are agents and this is how you make them. So it can give you a starting point for understanding when a company comes to you with a pre-made agent. It'll also give you some sense of how they can go wrong, and we'll get to that a little bit later. So often, though, one of the things that helps is you've done it before, so you can give it an example. That's another great way of thinking about, I do this a lot. I've got a lot of examples. I can show it to the agent or the AI, and it's going to know what I want on the back end. That's enormously helpful. So how do you do that? And this is where that mapping comes in. So again, this is what Miro's for. This is a bunch of whiteboarding and so on, where you're saying, hey, let's look at what we do. And again, I shamelessly grabbed this from somebody who was writing about process mapping, but you can see someone goes instead of lead signs, pays the EA, they coordinate onboarding, they plan capacity and so on. It goes here. And then once you've received payment, there's another flow that happens. So you can look at this and say, how can I automate some of this? And an interesting question is, Do I really want to automate all of this? In this case, the decision that the person made was no, I don't. We're going to go and automate what happens after a certain point. So this is stuff that we're doing already. We probably want a human to be part of this, you just because it's more complicated, and right now I just want to be aware of it. But we've gone and automated all of this, which is really interesting. So once payment has been received here or confirmed, it triggers a series of five things that gets you where you would have been anyway. But they've chosen to keep this human mediated, or a human is doing that. That's going to be an increasingly important part over the coming couple of years as we look at things we can automate. What do I want to keep an eye on? And do I need to do it myself to keep an eye on it, or do I want to create a dashboard? What do I want to automate now? What do I want to automate later? I think the point of today a little bit is to begin getting you comfortable with these sorts of things so that when the time comes, you're making those decisions from a place of at least some familiarity. So kind of having talked about some of the baseline areas here, the next thing I want to talk about, and this is a general point about AI that I've made before, we run the risk sometimes of overestimating how smart the AI is and how capable it is. Often we'll talk about intelligence and then we automatically assume intelligence means competence, and that's very much not true. I'm at probably at least of average intelligence, and I'm competent at certain things. There's a lot of things I'm not competent at, and that's very true for AI as well. So a first starting point is to say if the process is hard to map, it's probably too big for an AI agent. It's probably too complicated for an AI agent to handle now, certainly not one. The other thing that you're often going to do whenever you can is try to break it into pieces, whether those are what we'll call skills or different agents. Being able to focus is really helpful because it helps you to make something that's reliable that you can test over and over again. And the trouble with testing big, complicated things is you don't know where it broke. So the smaller you can make it, the more easily you can identify what broke and go in and fix it. Otherwise known, by the way, as debugging. So welcome to that. If you're going to build or be part of building agents, you're going to have to something to do with debugging, or at least be aware that it's happening. So with that, and I hinted at this a moment ago, how do you think about agents? Like, I started with the term agent, not AI agent, on purpose, because the point here is how do you get work done? Right? Not how do I use AI or not, but how am I using software as it's now being, and I think AI agents are providing an impetus, and they're providing kind of focus and attention on the idea of automation. Sometimes you're going to use AI, sometimes you're not. The key thing is how am I getting work done? How am I allowing this to, or how is this allowing me to do more things? Because it's pulling away the things I do over and over again. The focus has to be on scalable, useful solutions. And to do that, they need to be reliable and they need to be repeatable. So what's interesting here is, AI isn't actually great at repeatability. In fact, generative AI, that's the point, is it's doing new things. It's adding creativity. It's adding some flexibility. It's really good at handling ambiguity. But again, our focus has got to be on getting work done. And when my inputs are ambiguous, yeah, AI is going to help me. But if not, then why would I use AI? And that's a thing that you're going to hear over and over again as AI becomes more prevalent in kind of software and day to day. If I can avoid using AI and I can just use standard software, it's going to be better for me. I mean, not always, but usually it's going to be it's going to be easier to make reliable. And once it works, it just works. I don't have to think about it again. So that's an interesting distinction that I don't think we hear enough. I think there's so much hype and excitement about AI. We forget that most of the software you're using in 5 years from now is still going to be not AI. The UI, the user interface, might be AI, but there's still going to be a role for classic software to do a lot of things. If for no other reason, then it's because I don't have to ping an API and use all the compute that AI uses right now, a point we'll get to maybe in another session. So as exciting as AI is and as useful as it is in handling ambiguity, it produces ambiguity too. And that's what I want to get at here. But I call the probability bargain. So the bargain that you make when you handle ambiguity is that you're going to deal with ambiguity on the way out. So a term you hear a lot is deterministic. And what that means is you click a button and the next action is predetermined. It's going to do every time what you think it's going to do. There is no flexibility, but also you can't click a different button and have it do the same thing. You can't talk to it. You can't give it, some email or whatever it is. it's going to need very specific, narrowly determined inputs, which we talked about earlier. But what comes out is reliable, or you have a bug to go fix, and then it's reliable again. In contrast, again, the bargain you make with dealing with ambiguous inputs is you have a probabilistic output, which means that it's likely to be right, but sometimes it's not. And you're going to have a broader set of possible outcomes than you do here. Now, again, you want that in a lot of cases. If you want it to draft an email for you, half the point is it's going to give you something that isn't canned and isn't the same thing every single time. But also, if you're asking it to make a decision to go left versus right, you're going to want to make sure that it overwhelmingly knows that 90% I'm going to go that way. And actually, it'll always go that way because you've got a cutoff. So there's a way of dealing with probabilistic outputs that is what we're talking about today, where you want to make the problem narrower. So the problem space is narrower. And problem space is a term that we talk about a lot when we talk about probabilistic software like AI. The cool thing is, again, unlike standard software, AI can handle a problem space. There is no real problem space in standard software. It's going to do X, and then you're going to get Y. In the case of AI, it can handle a broader set of things. So how do we think about the problem and solution space? So good prompts do this. That's the point, is you're giving it context, you're giving it tighter descriptions, you're better mapping between tools and commands, a little more about agents. But more importantly, fewer possible things that you're asking the agent to do. This is why I say that if possible, wherever you can, you want to make the agent you're dealing with smaller as opposed to bigger. So beware where people that say, I've got one agent that can do everything. Either they're dealing with a swarm of agents under the hood that you're not seeing, which is great, or they're asking the agent to do too much, and you're probably going to run into reliability problems. And by the way, reliability problems doesn't always mean it's giving you the wrong answer. It might just not be giving you all of the answer that you need. That's a much more common problem, is it gives you something that's correct, but it doesn't give you something that's complete. So I wanted to illustrate what we mean by problem space. So folks, real quick, today I'm going through this kind of quickly, so we'll have time at the end, but this is a bigger than normal amount of stuff I wanted to present to you. So anyway, when we say problem space, if you give a prompt that's really general like this, send an email to a customer. Well, okay, what's the tone going to be? Is it going to be terse? Is it going to be light? Is it going to be jargony? There's other options. Is it going to be long? Is it going to be, two paragraphs? Is it going to be, I don't know, whatever you think? What's the format going to be? Is it going to be paragraphs? Is it going to be, so you've given it a lot of options that it can choose. So you're not sure what you're going to get out of it. Typically, good prompting will tell you, let's make the problem space smaller by writing a better prompt, one that tells it what you want. So now the problem space is a lot smaller. So now it's going to focus on the words it uses. It's going to focus on phrasing and so on. There's an old expression in advertising, give me the freedom of a tight brief so that I can do a better job in that tight brief. Kind of the same thing here. In this case, maybe it isn't quote unquote a better job. It's just a more predictable, reliable job. The same thing is true of an agent. So if I've got an agent this is just me making a schematic in here, but if I've got an agent where it gets something, it goes to the router chooses from 5 different options. That option then goes into a router, which then has 4 different options of how it's going to process. And then this processor goes back to the router, and this processor goes back to that router, and this processor goes and gets that data, and this will go straight to an output. That's asking for trouble because there's an awful lot of ways this can go wrong. There's an awful lot of ways, depending on what your input is, where it might go, and you're gonna spend a lot of time debugging this. In contrast, if you say, hey, let's see if we can make this one simpler and maybe make multiple agents or somehow constrain it, a lot easier for you to test, got fewer options in here, a lot easier for you to turn it into a product that you can rely on. Because the worst thing is you create something like this, excuse me, and it works a couple of times and you forget about it and you start to try to rely on it and it starts kicking out errors or it starts leading you the wrong way. You may not know the first couple of times. It might look right. And then you realize, oh my gosh, it's spitting out the wrong thing. That happens in classic software all the time. It'll happen in agents even more. So this is why you want to make the problem space smaller, because it isn't just that you're getting something that'll work. It's something that you can rely on. You've now been able to debug it because it's a smaller thing to look at. So why does this matter? One of the companies we'll hear about in a second is called Arise, and they actually make tooling for the creation of agents. So they see a lot of agents. And as things have happened over the last 6 months, where more and more companies have tried to put agents into market, they're seeing trends. And one of them is people are making the problem smaller. That's why I'm talking to you about it today, is after 6 months to a year of people trying to make agents, we're learning some things. And one of them is what I'm sharing with you now. If you can make it smaller, it's going to work better. You're reducing the possible things the agent can do. The smaller solution space makes it easier to define that agent, so the front end is easier, leads to a more powerful agent because it's more reliable and you can use it for more things. So a general rule here is make the problem space smaller. I've now beaten this one to death, but hopefully it's breaking through. AI chatbots and copilots, they do better with better and more detailed specific prompt. I've seen prompts that are 3 pages long. You hear about, prompt engineers that make, 300 grand. And I'm like, well, wait a minute, aren't they just writing prompts? When you see one of the prompts that they actually do, you'll realize that it's not so different from software development in that they'll sit there and test and test and test and test and test and wind up with a really complicated prompt. You may find that you need to do that with your agent too, but in the short run, just focusing on focus and specificity allows you to test it and hone in on where the issues are, resolve them, and then make it reliable. That is what software development is. No one's asking you to learn how to write software, but you functionally are making software just without the code. And you'll hear this over and over again. Reliability is really hard. One of the things I heard the other day is that venture capitalists now are being really careful about what they fund because they want to see that it's scaled and people are using the agent or whatever typically I'm talking about an agent. They want to see that real people have used it in the real world repeatedly and often. Because in the beginning, a year ago, everybody was saying AI this and AI that, and they realized later that some things that look good in a demo don't actually scale very well. This is how you scale by making it smaller, decomposing your items so that you can really focus on making them reliable. And as I say at the end, the reality of any software development is you're creating it is hard, but debugging it is really hard. Happily, there's a lot of good tools out there that make it easy for people that don't necessarily want to do this all day long. Um, Something I mentioned a second ago, I want to dive in a little more. AI is famous for giving great demos. Great example of that actually is in like 2016, I guess. Tesla was out there, I think it was that early, was out there giving demos of self-driving cars, certainly 2017. And everyone was like, this is amazing. If it just keeps getting better this quickly, we're going to have self-driving cars all over the place. Well, it's 2025, and we're just starting to see Waymo, not Tesla, out there with, and I'm in Austin, Texas, where you're seeing them on the road. But that's 70 years later. That's really different. And some of that is what I'm saying here is it gave great demos in the beginning, but actually making it reliable as people wanted it to be took longer than we thought. And that's just generally going to be true. All software suffers from what we call edge cases. And in next 2 weeks, we're going to talk more about that. And these little failures that stop the system. So, we've seen this even with AI agents. So Microsoft Copilot has had a bit of a bumpy road. It was released. People weren't so happy. They pulled it back a little. They're releasing it again. Apple Intelligence, these aren't necessarily agents. They're just proving my point about AI generally. Apple Intelligence has been much slower to roll out. And actually, when I used it, it kind of broke my Siri, which was not helpful. I couldn't call certain people and so on. The broader point here is that agents that, what looks great in a demo, you really need to focus on how do you scale it. The cool thing there is you're hearing more and more about this. And we're going to get into that a little bit now, which is agent evaluations. So it's one thing to build a thing, but the way that you make it, yeah, thank you. Kevin just kind of probably uses Copilot more than I did in the chat. He was just commenting that it's getting better. Yeah, Microsoft knows how to make software, so they will figure it out. It's just, like I say, they rolled it out a little quicker because they probably had a story to tell Wall Street. What we're seeing now, and this is really cool, this is where it really starts to get pro, and you're going to see it in your real work, not your real life, is we're getting more and more focused on evaluations. I've heard some folks in Silicon Valley say that what differentiates one company from another is often how good their evaluations are. And interestingly, this is where in the construction space, knowledge of construction is going to wind up being important, both because it makes you brief a better agent and create a better agent. But also, I think this is really important. Evaluations are going to become one of the places that companies differentiate and prove they're better because their evaluations bake in knowledge of the industry, knowledge of the reality of processes, and so on. So I think this is super exciting. I'm going to talk a little bit. Arise, the company I mentioned a moment ago, they've done a lot with this. So there's three companies that I know. There's more than this. Just three that I know. Prompt Layer's been around a little while. By all means, and all of them, by the way, do really good videos and often do really good blog posts that are they're more technical than what I'm getting into, but often you can read them without needing to get bogged down in the technical jargon. They just are telling good stories about the state of the art about a lot of this. In fact, some of the research I did for today, I was looking at all three of these. So Prompt Layer is actually really good for testing out prompts. You need to do a little bit of hooking up that takes a little bit of code. But once you've done that, or you had someone do that for you, you can test prompts over and over again. And actually, it's really good. And of course, they have an agent process and agent tooling as well. But they were out there a little bit earlier. Galileo's even more full service and more full scope, as I understand it, than Prompt Layer. Hopefully, I'm not speaking ill of people who know them. Really, really cool. They do a lot of really good stuff. Interestingly, every time I've tried to sign up, they have a waiting list, which is doesn't I don't love, but obviously it's the nightclub everyone wants to get into. In contrast, you've got Arise, not contrast, but in addition, you've got Arise. They actually do more than just this. They've got machine learning, they've got computer vision, LLM, pure play LLMs, and now they, of course, do agents as well. They have done some good videos and done some good blog posts that I really like. Um, really good question. Sorry, I'll just stop real quick. Yes, I'll make the PDF of this available. I'll post it in a certain way on YouTube in the notes. Yeah, I know I'm going kind of fast. Thank you guys for your patience. But again, this will all be posted on YouTube, and I'll do a slide share, whatever the thing is called. So, I've talked kind of in abstract about what goes wrong. Well, there's a couple things that we know will go wrong. The API calls, they fail more often than I wish they did. And so you need to figure out how to make it fault tolerant. And the failure can be a bunch of things. It could be the AI's problem, the API's problem. It could be just some network thing. But when you're doing like sending an API to consumer software, it just messes up sometimes and it doesn't make sense. You try it again and it works and there's nothing wrong with your code. So you want to be fault tolerant and figure out how to avoid that. Sometimes if you're using some of these excuse me, human inputs, these ambiguous inputs, it might not get it right. You might have the input might be too vague, it might be misleading, it might mean more than one thing. We talked about the benefit of AI is that it's creative. Well, maybe it's got creative in a way that you don't want. Filters. So one of the things that is inherent in this is you'll often be putting filters in the process. So it's only passing through the things that you want. And maybe that didn't work, or maybe you defined it the wrong way. Maybe you said the inputs you should expect are this, and somehow an input came in wrong. Way back in I want to say 19, we created an AI voice product that would do daily reports. And my good friend Damon Hernandez tried it out for me. And I had in the beginning, are you done for the day? And it was a yes or no question. I think that was just a question, but no matter what, it was a yes or no question. And Damon said maybe, because he writes software and he knew that we'd done it wrong. And it broke because I had an expected range that was not how people really talk. That generative AI is better than that. It would probably handle it. But the broader point is faults happen. And so how are you making sure that the amount of faults that are possible is a narrower range? How are you making sure that you've allowed for that and you've got a fail safe? The idea of fault tolerance is building in a kind of a loop so that if it fails, it'll try again. And if you think about testing, some of this you'll do, some of this you'll hire someone to do, some of this you'll just be part of. But the key thing here, and this is the point I'm trying to make, is make it as granular as you can. You're going to want to test each node. The tools make this easier. A lot of the tools that we're talking about don't need code. But then you test a set of nodes that we often will call a skill. You test the whole thing, then you test with a bunch of inputs. You test with people you don't know. This is what beta testing in software is, just like normal software. So it's as you think about the process that you're going to be a part of or you're going to ask someone to do for you, expect this and demand this. You want to know that they're testing it so you can count on it. They may even give you a dashboard or some kind of a report to say, hey, we ran We automated a test and we ran it 100 times and it, worked 99 times. Um, but that kind of speaks to our general rules here is whenever you can, split off skills into their own agents that can then just be used by another agent. So you're going to hear more and more about agents as people call them swarms, which I don't love. They call them crews. There's a company called Crew AI that does this for a living. There's just some really cool frameworks out there that will allow you to not just have one agent, but have 20 agents that are really specialized. You've made sure they're bulletproof. So each of these mini agents you've just tested to the point where you trust it, you know it'll work. Then you want to think about your elements being fault tolerant. This again was my point. And sometimes, as the consumer of this, you may purposely try to throw a wrench at it to see what it does. In fact, I encourage that. By knowing how all this works, you become a better consumer, a better buyer of it, and hopefully you'll start doing some of this yourself. Avoiding loops and freezes. This is the biggest one, is it gets into a loop which looks like a freeze to you. Some of this is the early part where you really spent time mapping from the output of one node into another's output, and then just test the heck out of it. So guys, we're coming in for a landing here. Thank you all for walking through some kind of pretty intense kind of grounding in this. Now I want to get into the agents that are out there that you can use. So some of you may have heard OpenAI has got three agents out there. The one that I've heard of, well, that seemed to be the biggest deal, and it turns out I don't think people love it as much, is called Operator. Basically, what this will do is it'll go operate and go do stuff for you, very usually pretty personal stuff. So, and by that I mean things that you do as a person, not as a business. Although technically it can do that too. I've just heard about it for, book me a restaurant. In this case, I live in Texas where HEB is kind of the big place to go shopping, and they have I had it go to, I have an account there where it'll deliver for me. The operator will do daily tasks like this. So it's going through and it's actually, I tell it to go and, complete my grocery list. It opens its own browser, which is interesting. So it doesn't take over your browser. And then it'll go and it'll operate. I can go do something else and I come in and check in on it. And it's going to say, all right, can you sign in for me? Which is, I want to stop here so we don't have to watch it laboriously go through it all. But it goes and navigates without me telling it to. I didn't give it a URL. It went to HEB on its own. It says, can you log in for me? And then I logged in, and it went and it did everything. And it'll actually check in with you about choices it's making. It'll do all sorts of interesting stuff. So the point here is this is like an assistant that'll run off and do the grunt work and check in with you, sometimes a little more than you want, but it's early days. What I think will happen sooner than later is it'll create its own memory that you choose, including how to pay for things. So it really can autonomously do things. For now, it's what they call a research release. But is interesting about this, folks, and I want to really start to emphasize, the point of an agent isn't just that it does stuff, it's that it can do stuff while you're not there. And that's where this is, a lot of people are really interested, and I was too, that's what this is doing for you, which is pretty cool. Real quick. Yeah, some fun comments. One that you're hearing a lot about now is deep research. So actually, Google was the first to do this with Gemini, and I'll tell you, man, it's pretty good. Then OpenAI came up with theirs, which is really good. Also, you got to pay $200 to have access for now. They're gonna make it available later. But also Perplexity. This is the first time I'm seeing people use DeepSeek in a kind of commercially available product. But the cool thing about deep research is it's really good, man. Like you give it a question, it's going to go and look at a bunch of stuff. And I did this really fast in prep for this. I've done it a couple of times. So things like before I meet with somebody, it'll come back and give you a dossier. That's just amazing. If you have a sales call or you're talking to a customer, you're talking to somebody that you're about to go interview, all of this, it'll do really amazing research for you. All of it will be, so for the moment, none of it's behind a paywall. So it might not be great at going into LinkedIn, although again, LinkedIn has some pretty good stuff available in the open web. And you come back with this really great report. And the case of Google, because it's Google, you can pop it into Docs and then you've got it from whenever and I've done that. So now I've got 7 or 8 documents that are assets. They're things I can go back and look at later if I want, which is really cool. OpenAI does the same thing. You can copy it in that case. Perplexity has just launched that. I haven't used that one. But this gives you an idea because I don't have to be here watching this. I tell it what to do. It asks me some questions, which I also love. then I can come back to it later and it's either got more questions for me or it's got it done. So the key thing is I could do 15 of these at once. I could say, hey man, I got a huge meeting tomorrow, or we've got a pitch, or we've got a whatever. I'm going to open up 6 tabs and I'm going to have all of them go to Gemini. I'm going to have each of them producing a document for me. And then I go off and go for a run or walk my dog and I come back and these agents have gone and done 15 reports for me that I can now. The cool thing then is take all 15 of those, pop them into another one and say, take these 15 reports and write a script for tomorrow or tell me what I should think about tomorrow. So you're now doing in series things that really, I mean, if you think about how amazing that is, in maybe 10 minutes, I've gone and had pretty senior level research done, then I can pop it all into another one and say, summarize this for me, give me bullets for what I should worry about, give me questions I should ask tomorrow, give me questions that they might ask me, all sorts of fun stuff. We as an industry and as an economy are really not ready, and I don't mean that in a bad way. We don't know how to deal with this kind of capability yet. And I think over the coming year, I encourage all of you to try this stuff out and see how it helps you be more prepared, ask better questions, do things faster, do things you never would have done before. We talk about, losing jobs and so on, but I'm more interested in how it allows us to do a better job or do things we couldn't do more before, do more things than we could do before, make more money, not necessarily spend less, although there's both of that. The interesting thing also, and this is, I want to proceed with caution, you can actually get software built. Be really careful because this doesn't debug. So your software is going to be more interesting and more of a proof of concept than software that you can necessarily deploy for now. But what's interesting, Replit does this. There's another company called Lovable. This is going to change how software gets built because people like me that are more of a product manager can try something out as a prototype and then use that to say to a real developer, hey, look at this. This is what I mean, but not this. What's interesting is you can fork this code into GitHub and they can look at how the code was made. So these are agents on the software development side, which you're probably hearing about. Frankly, my experience so far, they're not ready for prime time because again, the debugging and AI is not great at finding bugs and debugging. Once you point it at something, it'll rewrite it, but it may not get it right. You still need a real person to be part of it. This is an area everyone is interested in getting better and better. My experience is that it's been not as great for a no code person. There's a comment in the chat that GitHub was at it first. Actually, their Copilot, I believe, was one of the first. People I know that write software will tell you that Cursor, GitHub Copilot, they're really helpful because they're a tool that someone who understands software and can make up for their weaknesses. It really extends their productivity. So it is pretty great. And I think everyone I know that's using AI to help them write software, it isn't end to end. It's helping with completions. It's helping with all sorts of stuff that's a pain in the neck, but there's still a human that's debugging it and reviewing the code and so on. We'll see. I think that you'll find certain types of software like front end, like simple stuff like websites are just, I think within this year, you'll be able to do a pretty great website without any code. You'll just tell it what you want and then be able to, give it feedback. You can kind of do that with Replit now. My experience with it wasn't that great, but I didn't dive in too deep. It's another issue with all of this stuff is it does take an investment in time to get past how to use it and learn how to use it. That's where the power often comes from. I know people that swear by Lovable, so it's just kind of cool. So some of the final points I'll make here is, and this is sort of what I was pointing at before, it's now possible for you as an individual or as a small group to create your own agents. And I think we're going to see a lot of that this year where companies look at where they're spending time, where they're wasting time, and think about how they can automate some of the things that really drive them nuts. Back to my point about what's the dumbest thing you do over and over again. There's some tools that allow you to do this. Zapier, a lot of people have heard of. I made it red because I couldn't recolor it. It's not because I love it particularly. Zapier is actually kind of the oldest. So I find some of what it does is better and some of what it does is a little more constraining. I think Nation is how they want to say that. Make, Bubble's a little more website focused, but I'm a big fan of Make. They allow you to do some pretty great stuff. Again, connecting software that you're already using in ways that are really interesting. And that brings us to this point where I say, autonomy is different and it's a new muscle for us. Being able to use these things to automate things like, let's say every morning you have a briefing, like it goes and looks at the next day or two of your calendar. It says, here's for your meeting, here's some things to know about them. Or I've looked at your emails because, again, you've connected it. Unlike Microsoft, where it was kind of doing that automatically, you've chosen to connect it and you've done some things that aren't very difficult to make it only look where you want it to look. But the point is, wouldn't it be great if you wake up every morning and you've got a briefing as if you were getting the president's daily brief? Either because it's looked at the weather and it's looked at what's coming and it's looked at this and it's looked at who you're meeting with and so on. It's looked at LinkedIn, whatever. Or it's giving you, it's looked at all the emails you didn't reply to yesterday and drafted responses that you can go look at and then go tweak and make into your own. This gets us to the point I was starting to say a moment ago is autonomy is really different. We're just not used to this. Yes, maybe you've got staff that do things like that. I think in this case, you're going to be asking it to do things that you would not always ask a human to do because they're maybe a little menial or whatever it is. But having agents work while you're not looking is really cool. And I think I challenge all of you to think about this year and even right now, but what are things I wish I didn't have to do that are pretty low effort, but repeated and over again? Like I mentioned, wake up with drafts for unreplied emails, get a briefing on all your meetings, get a folder of documents sorted. I had someone from a GC, I was like, what's the dumbest thing you do? He's like, well, QA comes and they give us a list of things that they found. It's not the final punch list. It's what they found this week or this period. And it's usually not ordered the way I want. We have to sit there and go through it. I'm like, that's a great little automation. It doesn't, it's just based on some simple rules. It's, 20 minutes to an hour, depending on the list that you don't have to do. It's just done for you. Like there's going to be a lot of little things like that it'll give you a draft and maybe you want to go noodle it yourself, but it did 80% of the work for you. Wouldn't it be awesome if all the a lot of the little things that you do, you got an 80% draft and you just had to be the editor? I find that really, really cool. So I'm going to end with a final point, though, that keeps coming up. And this is the idea that AI is going to take over. I just yesterday heard somebody talking about how I don't even know what anyone's going to have a job doing in 5 years. And the counterpoint that was made on that call was, products, models aren't products, workflows aren't jobs, tasks are not roles. So the distance between an automation and somebody's whole job it's a pretty big gulf. We know things as humans because we're in the room while people are talking or we're on a Zoom or whatever. We have context that's really hard to get into AI right now. And that may change over time, but in the time period that we're all worried about, the next 3 to 5 years, our jobs are going to change for sure. The things you can get software to do are changing as we speak. I've just shown you a way that some of them can. But it's worth keeping in mind that AI is still narrow. Even if we have quote unquote AGI, artificial general intelligence, that doesn't mean that it can do everything. It just means it can be taught to do a lot of things, or really everything a human can do. But it doesn't mean it was taught, and it doesn't mean we even know how to teach it. So that'll be an interesting one over the coming years. Is as AI becomes more capable, and as our agents become more capable, we are going to have to learn how to even tell them what we want to do. And it's not going to be as simple as following someone with video and so on. So I think there's a lot of excitement and it's deserved. I think we all want to be careful about how far we're trusting it yet, and make sure we're doing all the things I showed today, which is test, test, test. Okay. So with that, I'm going to open up for questions. Before I do, we've got two. I just am really excited about this. So in 2 weeks, we're going to talk about, some of the things I talked about today, evaluations and how to really think about how to make this. And then in about a month, we'll talk about working with AI agents, which is going to be much more about real use cases and diving into creating agents. I'm not going to be talking about companies and their products. There's some out there that are great, but that's not really what I'm trying to get done here. We'll talk a lot more about how to automate things and give some real specific examples.